My name is Kumo Apani. I am a registered counsellor. I've been in practice for 2 years and I'm a graduate of Cornerstone Institute. When I was a child growing up, I didn't specifically know what I wanted to do, but I've always known that it had to do with some kind of care, support work. I just realized that that's something that I'm called for and something that just came naturally for me growing up, so it made sense. I heard about Cornerstone from a friend of mine who actually went to Cornerstone Institute, and I decided to finally go for it and do it, so I enrolled. Funding was always a huge concern of mine. My family didn't have the means to support me, so when I finally heard about the bursaries available at Cornerstone, I applied for it and here we are. If it wasn't for the bursary, I definitely fear I would not have been able to be afforded the opportunity to be educated, to be trained. So I guess without this bursary, you could say I would not have been able to fulfill my childhood dreams. I would definitely advise prospective students to not give up on their dreams, to send their applications for bursary because it is available there, and to not give up. Thank you, Cornerstone.
To further yourself, your career, and have more options in your life. We get it. In order to do this, you need to increase your level of earning. But in order to do that, most of the time, you need to further your education. However, in order to further your education, you need to pay for it. But in order to pay for it, you need to further your education.
However, in order to further your education, you need to pay for it. But in order to pay for it, you need to further your education. However, in order to further your education, you need to pay for it. But in order to pay for it, you need to further your education.
But this cycle can be broken. At Cornerstone, we don't believe that finances should be a barrier to quality education. Speak to one of our advisors today and email info@cornerstone.ac.za now. In this time of great uncertainty, let us help you focus on one of the things you can be certain of: your education. Now is the time to earn your qualification and upskill yourself from the comfort and safety of your own home. We've been educating South Africa for 50 years. That means we're no stranger to a global crisis. We've got this and we've got you. Take control and speak to our student advisors. Email info@cornerstone.ac.za and enroll now.
And welcome to this quick but very important video on Cornerstone Institute's COVID-19 response plan. Cornerstone Institute has developed this response plan to ensure the safety of all students, staff members and visitors. Whoever you may be, when you visit our campus, there are a few safety measures that everyone will have to adhere to from the moment you walk in our doors. So how does it work? When you arrive on campus, the following will happen. Your temperature will be taken. If your temperature is higher than 37.5 degrees Celsius, then you'll be directed to a triage area. You'll be screened using a basic questionnaire. If you are showing symptoms of COVID-19, you'll be directed to our quarantine room. The next step from there would be to follow the referral program and get you tested at an approved COVID-19 testing facility. However, if your temperature is under 37.5, your hands will be sanitized upon entry and exit. Keep in mind that face masks are compulsory at all times. You'll not be allowed onto campus without a face mask. Your mask must cover your nose, and we ask that you please do not lower your mask when talking, coughing or sneezing. While on campus, we ask that you please keep 2 meters apart as part of the social distancing guidelines. We also request that you follow the following directions. Avoid direct contact. Hugging and shaking hands is not permitted. No mass gatherings during tea breaks or lunch, and all meetings are to be kept virtual except where unavoidable. You're required to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. Signs are placed in all the bathrooms along with hand sanitizer and hand wash. Please make sure you wash your hands frequently throughout the day, and rest assured that our facility will be washed and sanitized frequently. If you are sick, feeling as though you're presenting symptoms, or notice someone who is not adhering to the safety measures in place, you're required to report this immediately to one of our appointed health and safety officers. If you're unable to report to a health and safety officer, then report the matter to your nearest Cornerstone Institute staff member. If you notice someone not following the guidelines, before going to a health and safety officer, please first express to the person that their actions are not safe, as they may not be aware. If they continue, then you're obliged to report. You can request that your identity be kept anonymous when reporting these matters. If you'd like more details about what we've been discussing in this video, please see the full Cornerstone Institute COVID-19 response plan, which can be made available to you. If you're watching this video in preparation for attending our campus, we'd ask that you complete the online screen tool, which can be accessed with the link that accompanies this video. We're all adjusting to this new way of life, and it's our collective responsibility to keep each other safe. So please follow these rules and guidelines. With that being said, we'd like to welcome you to, or back to, Cornerstone Institute and wish you a productive, inspiring, and safe visit with us.
Are we live? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to today's panel discussion. My name is Tulani Dube. I am the Faculty Programs Coordinator in the Faculty of Entrepreneurship and Economic Transformation here at Cornerstone. It is an honor and a privilege for me to moderate this discussion that centers around student debt and the crisis brought about by student debt. So what we've done is we've brought up a number of panelists who have voices in these particular areas, and I think will be instrumental in driving this discussion and giving solutions. We would like to think of this platform as a platform not to create toxicity, or so to speak, but rather a platform where solutions can be gathered and different perspectives can be understood going forward. I'll be introducing the panelists shortly, but I'll just want to give a brief background of what we are dealing with. When we came up with the topic of navigating the complex terrain of student debt, we need to take into consideration that there are a plethora of reasons that affect this particular situation and make it difficult for it to be compounded to one factor. So for instance, on one hand, you have what is called the historic debt, and currently universities, public institutions across South Africa are owed in excess of 10 billion in debt by students. Then you take the socioeconomic situation of the country, and you realize that most of those people who owe that money cannot really pay for it. So there's that action to it. Then we look at the funding models as well that speak into that. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists that will drive this discussion. And I'd like to start with the youngest panelist on the team, which I think the youth are very instrumental in driving this discussion. The youth are very instrumental in building the future of South Africa. Welcome, Siyabulela Plaki. Sia is a second-year student at UCT, part of the Economic Freedom Fighters task team, student command task team. She's currently studying Bachelor of Commerce in Politics, Philosophy, and Education. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did.
Thanks, Siyabulela.
Did you say education?
Economics.
Yes.
Economics. I got it right. Okay. I think I said economics. Sia, if we look at just starting from maybe where students are coming from, just taking into consideration maybe coming from the fees must fall issue, and then the current debt that's accumulated. Recently, the CEO of University South Africa was quoted saying there's no way that universities can cancel the debt. What's your view? Are expectations from a student perspective, from a student command perspective, are the expectations of students unrealistic in terms of debt write-off? And also, how do you envision overcoming the situations that has led to riots at the start of pretty much every academic year, creating kind of like an expected system?
Okay, so to answer your first question, I don't think it is unrealistic of us to expect that student debt can be cancelled. In fact, if I could be arrogant to say, I think it is unrealistic of such institutions to think that they at some point won't reach a point where they have to cancel our debts, because what you see is that the people who are owing these debts can't pay the money. And if they can't get access to their academic transcripts, if they can't basically move forward and somehow try to generate some money, you ask yourself, how then are they expected to pay the student debt? It's just a cycle, a cycle of stagnancy, where you expect people who don't have money to somehow still pay money. So I don't think it's unrealistic of us to expect that student debt can be cleared. In fact, UCT, for the first time in its history this year, lifted the they lifted it in order to allow students to register. And if they could do that, it just shows that there is more they can do. It's just a matter of, are they willing to do it? And in terms of the solution, I think what the COVID pandemic has shown us is that government can be creative in finding ways to fund many things. We saw billions of money coming in, and right now we can't account to that. Where that is a different problem. But what I'm trying to say is that South Africa, or rather the government, can find ways and has shown that it has found ways and revenue from different sources. So I don't think it's unrealistic of an unrealistic expectation of us. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Sia. I'm going to bring on Shane Pierre, who he's pretty much from an organization called Ikusasa Student Financial Aid Program. So you try to bridge the gap between the public and the private in terms of funding models. Just maybe give me a background of what it is you do, and the context of student debt from where the organization has come from.
Okay, thanks, Tolani, for having me. Basically, so I head up fundraising and strategy at Ikusasa Student Financial Aid Program, which started way back in 2016 when we were hit by the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign protests, where government obviously didn't have the capacity to fund students. And subsequent to that, there was a ministerial task team that was set up by then heads Monday back in the education to really work with the private sector to see how we can fund students who couldn't afford to or didn't have access to funding. And as a result of that ministerial task team that was set up, the outcome of that was to establish a foundation and an entity which would be a non-profit public benefit organization entity that would fund students in the missing middle. And why I say missing middle is because the poor students that fall under the household income of between 0 to 350,000 annually, they are fairly funded by NSFAS. And that obviously was a decision made by the government, by our past president Zuma at the NEC meeting, to fund fee-free education for the poor students. Now, if you look at the missing middle students, they predominantly work between the 350,000 to 600,000 household income, and they didn't have a solution. So they were really too poor to be able to fund education, but they were too rich to access the NSFAS funding. And that segment is what ISFAP started focusing on. So ISFAP's mandate was to look at the missing middle students, and that's fairly a big chunk of students in this country. It's about 250,000 students out of the 800,000 students that apply for tertiary education every year. And in terms of size, that market is about 27 billion rands a year, which is big in itself. So if you look at and just to take you a few steps back in terms of the context about student fees and debt and the poor and the missing middle targets of students, the poor students, which is from household income 0 to 350, need about 42 billion rands a year to be funded. The missing middle need 27 billion rands a year to be funded. Now, as you all know, government is struggling more so now than 4 years back when the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign happened in funding or providing fee-free education to students. So even the poor students are not being able to be picked up in terms of funding. So that's where really ISFAP came in. to support some of the poor and the missing middle students in terms of funding. But that really is in an initiative, a PPP kind of a setup that we're trying to work with government to really match this funding gap that we have in this country. If you look at student debt, Tulani, we had 8.7 billion student debt in 2017, 2018. That ballooned, which is about 38% of the total fees that students pay. That ballooned to about 12 billion rands in 2019, which was close to 50% of the student fees that they pay. And subsequent to that in 2021, now that amount is ballooned to about 14 billion rands, which equates to about 62-63% of total fees that students pay. So we are sitting on a time bomb in terms of how do we sort this student funding and debt crisis that we have in this country.
I just thought of something. Sorry, I need to stop you for a little while I call in Johan Wiggins. You are talking about the missing middle. Now, Johan, you are co-founder of an organization called Student Hero. How did that come about? And also taking into consideration that there are basically three areas of focus if we look at students that are poor, that NSFAS will pay for, students that afford to pay for themselves and continue as everything is all right. Then the missing middle, which, to be honest, I think the bulk of students sit in there. How does your organization kind of play into this equation?
Hi, Tulani. Thank you very much for the introduction. Tulani, so what Student Hero does is we facilitate, so if a student wants to make an investment in education by means of a student loan, what Student Hero does is we facilitate that whole process. So what we basically do is we help the students understand the products. We give them access from a single platform to various student loan providers, from where they can then apply for a student loan and qualify for a student loan with our assistance. It helps reduce the interest rates and it just helps them in general to get better terms on their student loans. So to answer the question about the missing middle, the student loan, when I talk of a student loan, I talk about the traditional student loan that's granted by your major bank. It's an interest-only loan for the duration of study that is repayable usually between 4 and as much as 6 years. If we were to take a course fee of about 50,000 Rand a year for 3 years, the repayment of that loan amount will be at, I'm taking 13% interest, which is a pretty high interest rate on a student loan, will be about 4,000 Rand a month. So why I'm mentioning this is one can use that as a benchmark to determine what is really affordable, and then from that as a foundation to determine what exactly is the missing middle. Because if somebody can't afford that, then we're sitting with truly someone within the missing middle, because not even that is within reach for them. So Shane, that's maybe where we can talk, is that between 350 and 600, does a household need to earn more than 600 to be able to comfortably be able to afford 4,000 Rand a month? So I'll just put the numbers on the table and see if we can build something around that. Because I do believe 4,000 Rand is well within reach if the household income is between 350 and 600,000 Rand.
Just a quick question, maybe just 2 sentences, Shane, if you may. While we place these figures in a simple manner of saying 350, 600, have we taken into consideration the size of families? Because a Black family may be larger than a white family, just so to say as examples. Have we taken that into account? I think Shane's mic is off.
Sorry. Thanks, Rani. Good question. I think we haven't looked at it in that detail and that depth in terms of the needs analysis that we've done in our blueprint in 2016 when we presented to the cabinet and government and to the education ministry. But technically, that number would even increase further if we had to look at how many kids in a family. So we modeled it based on 2 kids per family. So if a family had between 350 to 600,000 annual household income and it had 2 kids, it would be fairly difficult for them to put those 2 kids through to university. So that's the sample model that we worked on.
Okay. I think it does need a bit of review though. Sia, you mentioned, I think I'm going to pose this question to both Sia and Shane as we go along. And also I just want to encourage those watching at home to post your comments, post your questions. The panelists are here to answer them, and it also makes it easier for them to take in your views and build better models going forward. Sia, you mentioned the issue of the availability of funds and the availability of and the creative ways money was raised, or how money was raised, for instance, when COVID came about. Do you feel that the private sector, for instance, or the financial institutions are therefore not doing enough in terms of viewing education as an investment for the youth?
Well, taking into consideration what Shane has presented, we can see that they are doing something. The private sector is doing something, but I could still say that they're not doing enough, because they are still the main beneficiaries of the output of education. We're educated, and then we are poured into the private sector, and they still benefit. And it can't be that they benefit so much from the output and still not have invested enough into the process. And I'm referring to obviously the educating process. So I think, in my opinion, there can be a lot more done, because what you see is, even in bursaries, for example, those are mostly captured by the elite. Those are mostly captured by people who, or rather, let me not say elite, let me rather say people who already have, it presupposes access to a lot of things, access to internet connections. So it's the people who really need it the most, that would be most probably poor people, and part of the missing middle. You see that they don't really have that much access to bursaries, because it just already presupposes a lot of other things that you need to have as a potential student. So I think, in as much as they are doing a lot more can be done, because a lot more has to be done. Yeah.
Shane?
Yeah, I mean, I get the perspective from the student side, I think, and from Sia's side. I think there's a lot more that can be done, definitely. But don't forget, Tulani, South Africa is undergoing a massive economic downturn. So, we were hit by the pandemic. Even before we were hit by COVID and the pandemic, we were already in a downturn. So, South African economy is not doing too well. The national taxpayer is not doing well. There's huge amounts of unemployment and inequality in this country. Government doesn't have the money to support education, that the amount that they promised way back in 2016, 2015. So I think there's much more that can be done. To just give you a snapshot, SFAP, ICUSASA Student Financial Aid Program, has deployed close to R1 billion in the last 4 years, close to 950 million rands in the last 4 years across critical skills, supporting missing middle students. And yes, the need is massive. I mean, like I said, 26 billion rands a year to fund the missing middle, and we're close to only deploying R1 billion. So we're far away from what we can achieve in terms of what needed out there.
Thanks. Just from a business perspective, Johan, the business model is, at the end of the day, there to make a profit, right? And Sia has already mentioned the issue of student debt can be written off, should be written off. I think I know your answer to this. It cannot be. I'm going to kind of throw a curveball and say, out of the box, if it were to be written off, how would you envision it? How will it be done?
I would say one can apply in hindsight the same rules that we are trying to use to cure the disease. So if we say we're going to make education free for a certain portion, and this is the criteria, nothing stops government from applying that criteria to historic debt. And then if you fall within that criteria in hindsight, your debt can simply be written off as well. We see the same practice in law, where you will usually be judged by, if law changes, you will be judged, you will be given the benefit of the doubt of the softer law. So I can't see why we can't apply the same principles. Shane, I'm not so clued up on the exact numbers. How far will that even get us out of the hole? Is that going to make a much of a difference?
In terms of paying out our debt?
If you look at the total debtors book, and we were to say, well, if we just look at how much of the total debtors book will have had free access to education, if we were to apply the NSFAS, the way the model changed to it being free versus a loan from, I think, 2017, how much of the historic debt book is pre-2017, the crisis that we're discussing this evening? Is this like,
well, a lot of that debt
old?
It comes all the way from 2010. Pretty much from 2010 till now, we're sitting at a 10 billion plus, 14 billion, I think, if I have figures correct. So it predates 2017.
Yeah, it predates, and I think 14 billion is a huge amount, and it's probably impractical to say that we could just wipe it off and write it off, because I think a lot of that debt is carried on books of universities, and if that debt is just written off, you need to find the money first to write it off. And whether government takes that guarantee to write that off, or private sector takes that guarantee to write it off, which is unforeseeable, or universities write it off. But at the end of the day, something has to give way. And what will give way is either quality of education that we have in this country, or some universities just getting liquidated. There is a challenge to that.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can I,
yes.
If I may, can I just add something? I was thinking also the CSI spending. There's not a lot of models that allow for CSI spend to be on historic debt. The way I understand most CSI spend is to let fresh students, to give new students an opportunity to gain access to higher education. Whereas CSI, something you mentioned, you changed the wording, but the elite has access to bursaries. If we were to allow CSI spend to be applied to student debt, also in hindsight, but still give the kind of the private entity the tax benefit, maybe we can shuffle some private funding into that debt hole, but still give the private sector the benefit of putting money towards education.
Thanks, Johan. I have a very interesting question, and I think we discussed, we had a brief discussion, Johan, about this. And Sia, just in terms of something that Shane mentioned, that a lot of this debt sits on the books of the universities. Do you think, or is there any way universities can be more accountable? Because this now speaks maybe to the issue of throughput and job creation. Are universities offering courses that are relevant to the job market, meaning speaking to employability? So for instance, if I'm offering a course to 10,000 students who cannot use it or find employment, how much risk or liability should I be taking? Or should I just, what's your take on that?
So yeah, that's a loaded question, but I think yes, we can't not consider how much autonomy universities have now been afforded since with the decrease in revenue that they get from the government. They have also now have an increase in autonomy, and thus they can act as powers onto themselves. So there is a part where we can hold these universities accountable, in that how do they expect that their students will pay back loans or pay back debts, but they are offering courses that won't get them employed. I think that we should be able to hold the universities accountable, and they should be held accountable, because I don't know another way to wrap my head around this. But it's just I can't imagine a university taking a decision to continue giving, because that wouldn't be quality education in a way, because the education that a university should give should be one that reflects the aspirations of a country. So if you are giving education that's not going to make me employable, then to what extent do you expect me to repay back this loan? How?
Yeah, I think maybe
Johnny,
I'm
if
wrong.
I can come in.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Tulani. This is also quite a topic close to my heart. I mean, what you're talking about is the PQM index, which is the program quality mix index. And I think in South Africa, we struggle a lot with the PQM index because the courses that we have don't talk to employability. The mismatch that we have between supply and demand is massive. It's the graduates that universities are churning out that are unemployable, like Sia mentions, by the private sector and the public sector, that is creating this massive gap. And because these courses, universities start many courses, but they don't close courses quickly. And they keep adding more and more courses because, their grants from the government are based on the number of, courses that they offer and the intake that they have and the graduates that they are churning out. But it's not really measuring the employability of those graduates that come out of the system, and the relevancy of those courses and degrees, whether it talks to the green economy, whether it talks to fourth industrial revolution, whether it talks to data analytics, 4IR, etc. We're not producing what is required by the industry in terms of graduates coming out. So there is a massive mismatch in terms of the program quality mix across universities in South Africa.
True.
And I can talk for another day on this topic, but there's something definitely that needs to be done.
I think
reform from a policy point of view from government.
Yeah, I think maybe it's an issue of universities becoming a law unto themselves. Tell me, Shane, your organization, the issue of throughput, how do you guys go back to check that, and how does that better your offering? Because I think we talked today, and your organization was awarded best bursary provider in South Africa. What differentiates you from everyone else? And I ask that question so that we find a way of saying, what are other organizations doing wrong that we can take from you?
So that's a very critical question that we need to answer, because I think when we started when the blueprint for ISFAP got created back in 2016, we wanted to do things right and do things more efficiently. And because private sector was backing us and funding us in majority, they made sure that return on investment is high, which means that the throughput needed to be high. And what we realized very quickly is that we need to provide wraparound supports and the whole ecosystem around managing a student's life cycle right from the day he starts campus right to the day he graduates. And really that wraparound support is about providing the extra classes, tutorials, mentorship, coaching, life skills, work readiness, etc. And that's really what helps a student progress, coming from a disadvantaged background or coming from a small township in Mpumalanga or wherever, and really excelling compared to a student who's coming from a Crawford school, for example. So really providing that wraparound support to our students on the ground at the campuses, hand-holding them, and if they're going under depression, providing them the coaching and the psychological support. If they aren't going under abuse, providing them that support. And that really has seen a massive jump, and that's basically what we call our secret sauce in assisting a high throughput rate. So if you look at the industry average, NSFAS's throughput is somewhere between 45 and 55%, which means that 45 cents of your rand actually delivers return on investment. An average corporate bursary program sits at about 65-70%. At ISFAP, we're sitting at 92% in terms of throughput, which is fairly high. And that only talks to the fact that we provide that wraparound support. So we don't throw money at the problem. Throwing money at the problem is one part of the solution, or funding the student. But it's providing that wraparound support, making sure the students proactively are monitored and evaluated on their performance makes the biggest difference.
It's interesting. I tuned into a webinar 2 days ago, and someone mentioned the correlation between the cost of education in South Africa in relation to the quality, and their view on it was, it is expensive, ergo it's good. I'm just, the reason I'm putting that to you is I have a question from Adelia Jacobs, and I think maybe Shane, this will go to you. It says, I'm curious about what the inputs are to align courses with the quality, the program quality mix, and how often does this index change, taking into consideration, I think, that markets change, environments change.
Well, I think there's a big disconnect between universities and industry. Universities being the suppliers of graduates and skills, and industry being the demand, the ones that absorb these graduates and skills. And I don't think industry and university talk enough. And there's no face-to-face engagement or industry-university forums where you understand what is coming out of the system versus what you're getting into the system. And I think that mismatch of not aligning to what skills are required for the future and preparing the future of the workforces of tomorrow is something that's not done. And we're sitting with a very archaic system in terms of the Department of Higher Education, in terms of how these courses are developed, credited, and then rolled out. I mean, you can count on your number of on your fingers the number of universities that actually provide courses that talk to the courses that I talked about, like the green economy, the future of agriculture, the future of manufacturing, 4IRR, digital economy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, South Africa has massive potential in terms of taking massive advantage in this space, but we don't have those right skills that the universities produce today. And then we have to then rely on importing these skills into this country.
I feel like I've stayed with you, Shane, for way too long, but I will pose one more question to you because of what you said, and I'm taking into consideration the bodies that you work with in terms of this, and why I pose this is to say, are they doing enough, and should they do more, or is it a tick box exercise? Because I think you mentioned the Banking Association of South Africa, Business Leadership South Africa, and those are bodies that represent very large corporates, which are very large purses. And while a lot of students, to be honest, while we'll talk inflation, while we'll talk that the economy is struggling, understand that the missing middle student or the poor student has been poor from the get-go. So whether there is a dip in the economy, business-wise, they have been living in that poor world. So it's just to say, with these bodies backing your foundation or your program, and don't get me wrong, you are doing an amazing job. Should they be doing more, or how do we get them to do more?
True. I think the entities that part of our foundation, I'll probably repeat that, is Banking Association South Africa, CISA, which is Association for Savings and Investments South Africa, SAICA, which is South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, it's BLSA, which is Business Leadership South Africa, and it's First Rand Foundation. So they're quite esteemed and big and well known in the industry with lots of member bodies, and I think they recognize the fact that industry needs to play a role in funding education, because at the end of the day, they feed their employers. But I think, also raising 950 million rands in 3 years is quite an achievement. And I think, there's only that much, you can keep going back to the same companies to get funding, because it then talks to donor fatigue. And yes, you can reach out to more and more companies from the JSC Top 100, but slowly, they also want to see what government is doing in terms of supporting education, how they're coming to the party as well. So I think the way forward in terms of private sector holding on is they want to see a PPP. They want to see public-private sector talk more and engage in a formal partnership and see how this can pan out. Because I think private sector is also holding back to say, you know what, if we're going to do all of this, where is government coming to the party? Government's contribution to funding education has materially decreased this year compared to last year, even though they promised to fund fee-free education for the poor, and they aren't able to. I mean, you've seen the news, UNISA was asked to cut down 25,000 applicants. They've rejected 5,000 of NISTA students in last year's disbursement of funds. So, private sector can only come to the party that week, and I think we're trying our best at this fact to engage more and more with government and private sector. But yes, I absolutely agree, more needs to be done, and the problem is big.
Okay. Thanks, Shane. Johan, you work mostly. Does your organization engage the government in any way in terms of who you fund? I'm assuming you fund the slightly well-off student. I'm trying to get is there
I would say in this context, we can probably refer to our typical customer as any student can reach out to us, but typically the ones that succeed are, from a certain income tier.
Okay, and I think look, to be honest, I think there's nothing wrong with that, but it also speaks to the issue of accessibility, because we've clearly put it in that there's 3 sectors that need to be funded, and the 2 at the bottom right now are the missing middle and the poor, and obviously I think the issue of just having more information out there is very vital. But having said that, Sia, I'll take you back to your issue of accountability to universities. How does one envision holding universities accountable? Because universities have grown into mammoth giants. They are pretty much laws unto themselves. How does one go about ensuring that?
I think in holding universities accountable, the onus is not on us as students, because we have tried many times since fees must fall. That's basically us trying to hold these universities accountable. But the accountability and the pressure needs to come from government. Government needs to be the one applying this pressure, because it can't be us, the end rather, if I could lightly put it, the consumers. Having to, it has to come from the government, and the government has to do more. But in the state that they're in, and that their contribution to education has declined, they also have a limitation on how much they could exert onto the university. So I think that also plays into part. But definitely the accountability has to be something that is pressured by the government, not us as students, because we have tried. And we are trying each and every year, and it's not working.
I urge you to keep trying. I think the youth are vital in changing a lot of things. So I will urge you to keep trying. Do not burn down anything, though. I am a firm believer in protests. One has to get their point across, though. And I think at times that's the only way of engaging. Shane, in terms of funding structures, obviously a lot of organizations we're back to the issue of employability. How much should we be doing in terms of creating a link between SETAs and higher education? I think there's an argument that those who run through the CETA kind of setup are more employable because they've been tested on the job, rather than the theory-based university graduate.
Yeah, I think maybe I just want to touch base a little bit back now, 2 steps back on what you asked Sia as well, Tulani, in terms of are universities only responsible? And I think if I can just add one comment on that is, I think you guys like Cornerstone Institute, like some other courses, degrees and universities that offer short-term courses is something that needs to be looked at, more aggressively, because not everybody goes to a university. Not everybody has to go to university. Sure. Students can go through TVET colleges, short-term courses, short-term programs, and can quickly upgrade their skills and join the economy and be productive, and be employed. You don't have to go through a 4-year degree or a 5-year degree or a 6-year degree. So I think universities are overburdened in terms of a lot of students wanting to go to universities to become graduates to be productive. But I think if we divert a lot of traffic towards TVETs, towards trade skills, towards short-term courses, towards coding, and towards the future of economies that exist out there in the 21st century, I think we can get a lot of meaningful skills that are needed by the private sector and public sector so that they can be much more productive. So that's just on that. On your question on CETAs, I believe we are trying to exploit and work with and engage with the CETAs quite productively. I must say, even though we are set up by the private sector, 2/3 of our funding comes from private sector and 1/3 comes from government. So we do work with the CETAs in some of the critical large funded CETAs because we believe they have a massive role to play. Bursary funding in this country is not very efficiently done. And I was just looking at stats the other day. We have 464 bursary providers in this country. Now that's massive, right from one-man shops to 20, 30-man teams. And we're a small outfit. We're almost 30 people at ISFAP. But we are one of the biggest now in the country. And because we have technology, we can scale up. But you can imagine 464 bursary providers in this country. That's a very muddied market. Not all of them are effective, not all of them are efficient, and not all of them get high throughput rates. So there's a lot of inefficiency in the bursary management space in this country, which we're trying to become the one-stop shop solution for, because I think there's a lot of cleaning up that needs to be done in the bursary space as well. But just to close out on that discussion on CETAs, I think CETAs collect quite a bit of money, trillions, quite a few billion rands, not trillions, quite a few billion rands, and I think they have quite a few sectors that predominantly work with the future skills sector. So I think we're tapping into some of those, but we're far from reaching that potential where we could work with all the 25 odd CETAs that we have in this country.
Sia, would one say, interestingly enough, if one is sitting and listening to this, we shouldn't really be having a funding problem considering all the players on the market, but also one has to consider that the population is quite big. So in terms of, would one say, and I'll post this to both Sia and Johan, and Johan, is there a lack of information out there, or is there just a lack of money, or both?
I wouldn't say that there's a lack of money in my perspective. Maybe yes, there is a lack of information to some extent, because lack of information I think it presupposes perhaps one not wanting to access that information, but we also have to question who has access to this information. You have to question those things, the accessibility, basically what we've already mentioned. So I do think to some extent, yes, it is a lack of information, but not because of one's choices, but rather one's like accessibility to such information. Yeah.
Johan, what's your take on that? I think Johan's mic is off.
I promised myself I'm not going to miss the mic, and I actually missed it. Tulani, what I was saying is I'm not sure if I can give a good answer on this, because I don't quite understand. I would need to have more insight into why students miss so let's say we commend Shane and his team for what they're doing. So we know there's a lot of effort being put into making funding available from their efforts. Now one needs to look the students that does not make the cut. Did they not make the cut because, so there's usually two qualifying criteria. There's merit, and then there's the academic requirements. So maybe academics is also part of the problem. Students aren't making the cut. You got, as a panel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or give me an estimate of how many students miss the cut due to academics and how many miss it due to merit. Yeah, that will give me a better idea of how to answer the question, because then the root of the problem is actually much lower down in the system, not so much when we reach higher education. Maybe we don't even qualify for higher education, and then funding becomes irrelevant.
It's an interesting take on it. I'm going to ask, because this is a student problem. I'm going to ask. There's two students from Cornerstone. I think Jason and Vusi. I think Jason is the deputy president of the SRC. I just want your views on where we are in terms of the crisis, and you've been following the discussion, and just to give a brief commentary while we take it from there. Vusi, are you there?
Yebo, good evening.
Hi, Vusi. The floor is yours.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, cool. Awesome. I'm really enjoying like the discussion, and I'm like, it's really insightful, right? I just wanted to comment on the bursary part, and then on the poster of the event itself. So at firstly, there's a poster, and then there's a girl, and then she's holding a placard that says education is not a privilege, right? And from like drawing from what you guys have been saying, I feel that education is actually a privilege, because the struggle of the student doesn't actually begin when they are like at a tertiary level of education, but it begins way back. You know what I mean? It begins at home. So it begins in the primary schools. So when someone actually gets to college or to universities, then like the problem is just exacerbated. It's just added on, right? And then there was a question regarding bursaries, and I believe it is the lack of information. So there's merit that is considered, and then there's academic performance, but then there is also the lack of access to the information about these bursaries, about where do I apply, how do I apply, what is required of me. Because sometimes, as I think Shane was saying, right, so the bursaries that you guys provide are for certain courses. So you find that I receive, maybe I'm from a disadvantaged background, right, and then I receive a bursary, but it's not for what I want to study. But you know, hashtag education is the key to success, so you have to roll with that, because in today's world you can't just like live and survive on a metric qualification. Yeah, but I do feel that education is quite a privilege. It's for the elite few, or for those who have access to the information and the spaces, you know. Yeah, but just listening to you guys, that's what I'm picking up.
Thanks, Vusi. Before we bring Jason in, I just want your quick takes on what Vusimuzi is bringing to the table. Basically, these are the issues. Education is a privilege. there's lack of information, lack of access, and most importantly, he's stated that the bursaries in play force you to study particular modules or particular programs, which then speaks to the issue of are we creating programs for the market we're serving? Just a quick take of what you guys think of that before we move on to Jason. I think Shane will go first, and yeah.
I mean, absolutely, I agree with Wusu. I mean, there is a massive lack of access and information. I mean, just to give you examples of what we went through from our early stages, Tulani, when we started in 2016, end of 2016, beginning 2017, which was our first cohort, we were fairly manual because we didn't have people. We were operating with 4 people, 5 people in the office. We didn't know how to approach, how to market the funding. We had raised the 50 million rands in the first year, but we didn't know how to spend it. We had to quickly get students. We had close to, I think, 1,500 applications in the 1 month that we advertised. And it was fairly manual because we went out to the universities and we just said to the universities, ISFAP can provide bursaries. And if students apply and register to you, tell them that this bursary is available. But what we then realized is that manual process will not get us far. And if we wanted to become the biggest bursary provider and we wanted to solve the 250,000 student gap funding crisis, we had to use technology. And the moment we used an online application platform, our numbers jumped from 1,000, 2,000 to 22,000 applicants. So that was a massive jump in the amount of students that could apply. And I hear what Sia says that even providing an online access for people to apply, you're presuming that they have internet. And yes, that's a challenge because, if Sia was in a small township in Limpopo, she probably didn't have access to internet and she couldn't apply. But I think, that requires a whole different kind of brainstorming on how you reach out to those level of students and how do you go down to the basic education and how do you go down to schools and public schools and townships, etc., to then start canvassing about coming into the system. But for us, the problem that we're trying to solve is not so much of a student problem, it's more of a funding problem. So ISFAP is not sitting with lower amounts of funding that is required. So currently, the funding, the rand and the dollars is what the constraint is, not the number of students. So even though we get 22,000 applications, we can only fund 500 students, which in itself is quite a bit every year. So we're sitting with a funding challenge more so an application challenge right now. So for us, the lack of access, lack of information is kind of alleviated by the online application platform. But I agree that we're not doing enough in terms of reaching out to students in townships and really rural background areas where they don't have internet.
Johan, your take on Vusi's commentary? Are you with it? Are you against it? Or, may I have sound for Johan, please? Thanks.
Hopefully twice bitten, one shy. I think if it's not to tie in with what Shane said, if it's not a level playing field, then it becomes a luxury, which only some can afford. So if we're still sitting with challenges like not all students even has access to the application portal, which is where the action is at, regardless of how good you make yourself with your academic results at basic education, the level field isn't playing. So I think the tools to access the efforts that Shane and his team is plowing in to raise this money is a fundamental factor that one need to consider is how do you reach the people that are actually deserving? Because one can argue then and say, well, everyone in basic education has the opportunity to work towards a bursary. But now we need to give all those students that put in the effort access to that bursary. Not creating a new discussion, but I totally tie in with what he said. If we don't level the playing field, then it's definitely considered a luxury for some.
True. Sia? Is your mic on?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I won't expand too much into the privileged part of of education. But in principle, in principle, I would love to disagree that education should not be a privilege, of course, because if we are equal and equal in front of the law, then we should have equal access to things such as education, because it is an essential need. But Shane and Johan have already expanded into it. What I'd love to expand into is what Uvo Smuzi touched on when he said that you are then forced to study certain things that you would rather not, but it is what's funded by the bursaries. And just to bring it home, I have particularly experienced difficulties in finding a bursary, because I have not heard of a bursary that funds PPE students. And then it speaks to the disconnect between the market and the university, and that the university is providing certain courses. However, maybe that's not what's in demand for the market. So where is the university now getting the information to then provide such courses like mine, or continuing certain courses, even though they're not what's in demand, or even though they're not what will be supported in the markets?
Thanks, Sia. Politics, philosophy, and economics, Shane. Those are the courses you need to be funding for our future leaders. I'm just putting it out there. Sia has mentioned that you guys are not funding that. It's been put out there to the universe. Is Jason
Absolutely,
around?
Sia. Get us some funding from some political parties. We'd love to take that.
Of course.
Yeah.
It is a critical skill that we need in this country. Seeing how badly political parties are required.
Weirdly enough, I seriously think that's something you need to consider funding. It speaks to the leadership we need to groom. You need to understand the economy. You need to understand the political landscape. So maybe those discussions need to be had with the students at grassroots level. And, maybe we just need to look at them in a different lens. Because the moment you mentioned that, for instance, someone from the student command is on the panel, we already view them differently. So I think these are young leaders we should be engaging with. Jason has connection issues. I'm just going to try to read his comments. Jason, maybe switch off your camera and
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to read the comments that I've made. I just want to share some thought that I've had in relation to the comments that I've made, and because of the connection, I couldn't really get the gist of what the speakers have been saying. However, I am in agreement with what certain points on what they have communicated. I think there is a need for conversations between stakeholders like government, private sector, and CSI, because the divide, there's a big divide in terms of that, in terms of my interaction, in terms of the development space. Because I've been working for 15 years in the youth development sector, trying to break down the barriers of giving and helping youth having access to tertiary education. So being in the space of skills development, whereby you give people skills development training, whereby they are only being given a skill without accreditation, created another barrier, because then when they do apply for jobs, they are being put on hold because they do not have the accreditation for that specific skill. Now, the next barrier that we have found now, if you have the people that has gone to university, that got to the bursary, they are set down now because they have a debt of 30, 40 to 70,000 rand that they need to pay down in order for them to do the
Jason, I'm struggling to hear you. Are you guys clear with what Jason's saying?
Not really, no.
Yeah, I think what I did get from Jason is that there needs to be more conversation between government and the private sector, which is something that I think we've touched on. And I think that needs to happen a bit more. And then I think he mentioned something about taking into account the CSI budgets. Perhaps that's something we haven't looked at. How much of the CSI budget should be used in funding students? And again, I think this speaks to an issue of us looking at whether education is looked as an expenditure or an investment. I think Shane, you're best suited for this one. If
Yeah. So the biggest funding that comes into education right now is obviously CSI and EEE funding. And as Johan alluded to it earlier as well, we could do a lot more with CSI funding into education. But having said that, if you look at the triology report that gets published every year, education is currently the biggest component of CSI spend in this country. Close to 65, if not 70% of the funding that CSI spends its money on is on education. Now, obviously, it's not only bursary education, but it's multiple other education. So whether it's education in the community, whether it is short-term courses, classes, employees, etc., it's quite dispersed. On the BE side, ISRAP was quite instrumental with working with the Department of Trade and Industries to actually improve the points that industry would get for their spend on skills development. And now a company can actually get 4 points on 2.5 spend of their levyable payroll, which was actually 2 points earlier. So that's doubled. On the CSI, there's not really much incentives that government has provided for companies to actually incentivize them to fund education. And I think the only benefit that they have would be a Section 18A tax exemption certificate. So I think a lot more can be done, because I think as a country, we spend quite a lot on CSI initiatives. And I think obviously during the pandemic, a lot of that CSI money went into healthcare. And we've seen that because we've seen a lot of corporates diverting a lot of funds towards PPE and healthcare. But I think eventually, post the pandemic, post the vaccination process, more and more money will definitely go into education, because at the end of the day, education underpins inequality, unemployment, poverty in this country. So it has to be the front runner in terms of the amount of money that is spent in it.
Okay. I'm just going to thanks, Shane. Just a quick question for Johan. In terms of your model, yours is obviously a loan, interest-based, right? How does that work? I'm just trying now to get information out there to say, how does that work? Because we've got the gist of a bursary, and we haven't been talking much about the loan system. I want to find out how that works, and maybe that's another option for students out there, for anyone who's listening, who reckons I may fit into this category.
Didn't catch me this time. So education is an investment. We can all agree on that. And the return on that investment vests in the form of the student's increased or future earning potential. So if in that context, you can basically see a student loan as leveraging to acquire the skills which will allow you to earn that increased income in the future. And what the banks have done to make this product very affordable, because obviously now you want to make that window while you're studying, while you're acquiring these skills, you want to make the minimum payment as affordable as possible. Otherwise, you're basically going to outprice the investment. So what the banks have done is they've made the loan interest only for the duration of study. Unfortunately, a student still needs to bring with the application somebody who the bank will regard credit worthy and who has the necessary affordability to qualify for the student loan. And that person will have to pay only the interest amount on the loan for as long as the student studies. So to take a practical example, if we were to borrow, let's say 50,000 Rand for a year's fees, the student and or the sponsor will have to repay only 500 Rand a month for that duration, for that year of study, with the 50,000 Rand, the principal amount being repayable over 4 years thereafter. So for somebody who can see that their income will significantly increase if they can just acquire that skill, to take the loan to acquire the skill and then start repaying only after they gain that benefit from the investment makes total sense. But then it becomes very critical that one needs to explore before you take out the loan. You need to do your homework the same way that you would if you were to invest in a property, or if you were to think a vehicle is an investment. You would need to do your research and see whether or not the thing will depreciate or increase in value. Look at market factors. Look at how employable am I making myself, or am I studying towards a dream, or am I studying towards an actual income that is there? So what I can maybe close this off with is, and Shane, that's what I think you guys are very good in nurturing that student throughout the whole process, is what we can possibly also consider is making available for students mentors and people who they can truly engage with, to check, is this what I truly want to do? Is what I perceive a lawyer to be, or what I perceive a soccer coach to be, really what it is in reality? Because we're all very much plugged into screens all the time, so we see snippets of what life is, and those snippets can trick you sometimes, and you end up making an investment in a dream which very seldom bears fruits. So the tool is brilliant. It works the same way that you can take out a bond if you want to invest in property, but then you need to make sure you're investing. You're not buying a very expensive hobby for yourselves.
I see you nodding your head, Sia. Are you in agreement?
Well, not fully, just because Johan did state at the beginning that the loans are for a certain not tax bracket, but for a certain income level. So if at that level, I can agree that loans are not a feasible funding idea for the ones that are disadvantaged. So
will they be
Sorry?
feasible? Will the loans be a feasible solution if employment was guaranteed, though? So we're moving away from it being a debt crisis to more of an unemployment crisis. So will the loan system be something students will look to if there was a guarantee of employment? Just throwing it out there like that.
To some extent, I disagree, because that would be reducing the whole problem to employment. Whereas I have been, I'm of the view that there are many other things that come into play, even at the point where I have to go into university. Do I have, as I've said, access to these loans? Because the loans aren't given to just anyone. They are credit checks and yes, as a young person from a township, are their parents credit worthy? There's a lot of things that go into the part where I even have to enter university. So just reducing it to the part of the exit level, I don't think I'm not in agreement with that. But at the level of which we have, I think it was a sort of principal agreement that loans are sort of accessible to those who of a certain income level, and they thus can manage that. But below that, I don't think it's feasible. I think it just creates another crisis of its own.
With what I may term, Shane or Johan, I'm really not sure where to throw this question, so I'll pose it to both of you. I think what I may term I think it's been called discriminatory tendencies by banks, financial institutions, in terms of funding. How much of a role do financial institutions play in this space that drives loans and eventually student debt?
Shane, if I may, look, the loan space is very regulated by the credit regulator governs that space. So there's very stringent rules on reckless credit and the type of criteria that a bank needs to apply to avoid over indebting consumers. So just from a, so this doesn't cover all banks, not all banks, not all type of loans, because you do get loans offered by the educational institutions which are completely repayment free until the student is done studying. So I'm speaking specifically for bank loans, and see, I totally agree. It's not a one-stop shop, fix all the problems as far as access to education is concerned. But there are definitely a guardian angel in that space to help parents not over-indebt themselves and create the problem in the student loan, the traditional student loan space. What I don't know if it is regulated is the way that universities regulate the type of loans that they give out. But this is sort of, one needs to be careful, because now you say, okay, well, let's check whether or not we're going to over-indebt someone, then you're taking another resource away, where one needs to consider the only time it becomes a debt crisis is if the investment does not materialize. So to put too stringent regulation on the universities or NSFAS when their bursary converts to a loan might take access away again. So yeah, it is regulated, and we also try and play our part on educating parents, because it can create a debt trap, because education is funded 1 year at a time. So when you're applying for funding, you're doing it 1 year at a time. But in fact, you're making an investment that's the sum of all 3 years' expenses. And one needs to not only, you need to consider that you're making sometimes a 350 or a 300,000 Rand investment or a 250,000 Rand investment, where in fact you're just taking out a 60 or a 70,000 Rand loan. You're creating a debt trap for yourselves right off the bat if you don't consider the full commitment that you're engaging in.
I think it also just speaks to financial literacy or just empowering people along those lines as well. Shane,
Lonnie, this is one final remark. I do want to commend the banking sector. Is that I do see a lot of effort on their part on also putting financial literacy out there, because it's in no one's benefit to over-indebt someone, because it means you're saddling yourself with a loan that can't be repaid. So just a shout out for our banks. I think they are really playing their part in trying to educate people on how to repay loans and take out loans more responsibly. Sorry, Shane. I just wanted to put that out there. They're not demons. They're also just trying to.
Shane?
I think just to I mean, I won't spend much time on this, but I think just talking to Sia's point in Johan, that banks in this country are quite risk averse, in the sense that they want the credit scores and they want to do all those checks and balances. So it's not been a very profitable product for banks, and if they don't see, or if they see higher risk with student funding, they kind of stay away from it. And that's where students suffer. So I think the banks haven't come completely to the party. We could do a lot more with banks in terms of making funding more accessible to students on much better terms. And if government backed them in terms of some guarantees, or National Treasury backed them in terms of some guarantees, and if we worked, like for example, the future of ISFAP would also have some amount of loans, because we do believe there is a space for income contingent deferred payments, which we call ICDPs, and income sharing agreements, and that really talks to the fact that not all households come from a background where they can't afford education. So there's the poor, there's the missing middle, and within the missing middle and a little bit higher than the missing middle, or the upper higher missing middle, they can afford to make some payments. So there could be some loan agreements or loan arrangements or products that are out there that could help the higher income bracket segments. So, I mean, the future of ISFAP would talk about how can we work with the banking sector, and that's why we have the Banking Association on board, work with the banking sector, work with SARS, and work with financial institutions and the university to say, okay, once these students graduate, SARS, like how they take out their tax, they can also take out an amount from the loan, or banks can debit their loan. So we're working on something like that, but that's way out in the future. But I do believe that the loans is definitely, there's a space for loans in the market for funding, providing access.
I urge you to speed it up so that it's not way up in the future, Shane. It is a crisis, so that would help if you speed it up a bit. I would have answered this question, but it's posed to you, Shane. So maybe just a student, Apollonia. For Shane, do students have to pay the bursary back or is it just free? I'm asking because companies usually want a return for their money. So, yeah.
Yeah, excellent question. I think what for now, all the money that we've collected, close to R1 billion in terms of disbursements that we've funded, close to 2,200 students on the platform in the last 4 years, none of the money has to be given back. So it's completely grant-based with no return. Of course, we sign contracts with students to make sure that they finish their degree in stipulated time, which is important because if we are funding you for free, we expect that you get good grades and you study hard and you attend your classes and you have no excuses for not doing well. And that's why we also fund the full cost of study, which means that we don't just fund tuition, we fund tuition, accommodation, transport, meals, books, stipend, laptop, healthcare, etc. So we want to make sure that the student is completely funded because if a student is not fully funded, if a student doesn't have food in his stomach, you can't expect him to go and attend classes. If a student doesn't have money to take the taxi to go to university, you can't expect him to attend classes on time. So we believe that if you don't provide full cost of study, you can't expect the same results of high performance from a student if you don't fund him fully. So right now, it's completely, to answer Polonia's question, it's completely grant-based. There's no money to be paid back. But of course, when we get into the loans model in the future, there would be a loan arrangement with the student. But right now, it's completely free. We just want them to study, do well, and get a job.
I really commend what you guys are doing, Shane. It's amazing. I think there is a comment that I just noted, and maybe it's something we've just been talking about. So I'm just going to read it out. This discussion has further confirmed the urgent need for a conversation between government and the private sector on education funding model. Otherwise, the inequality we see today will continue for generations to come. I completely agree with that statement. And I think this discussions really needs to be pushed further into government, obviously by people like Shane who have these discussions at a high level, just to alleviate the inequalities we see and to make sure that we look at education as an investment and not as an expenditure. Weird question.
Just to talk to that, Thulani.
Yeah.
Just to talk to that, I absolutely agree with that. I think, and it has worked, right? PPPs across the world have worked in developing and developed countries. In South Africa, it has worked. I mean, whether you look at the IPP, where public-private partnership in renewable space has worked. Now it's working in infrastructure space, where we're working with private and public sector working together to see how we can fund R1 trillion worth of infrastructure in this country. It has worked in so many other areas. So there is no reason why PPP and higher education cannot work and where public and private sector needs to come. It's all about the willingness from government to be part of this and to work together with private sector to make it happen.
See, I'm going to pose this question to you. Honestly, I can't even believe I'm posing the question, but I will pose it. In terms of the funding model that Shane has talked about, your take on the free model, does that not create a culture of entitlement? If I am paying for everything, how do we guarantee that the student holds up their end of the bargain? And I ask this, there are students who've worked through this and are very grateful for it and it's worked. But do we not then create a culture of entitlement?
Okay, so I sense that I'm going to bring in a bit of a problematic view, but just as I have noted that education to me is an essential service, I can liken it to healthcare. It is an essential service. So now if I can say I'm entitled to healthcare, no one's going to question me because it is a basic need. So now if I tell you that I am entitled to education and that if I am to be a meaningful citizen, if I am to add value to the market and thus the country as a whole, and to some extent I am entitled to education, but I do agree, and I do agree that there should be obviously ways that the student can be held accountable. And I think that's where academic ways and all those levels of where the university starts to regulate all of these. But I can also call those into question because they're quite problematic. But yes, to some extent, we can say students should be held accountable. But yeah, education to me, because
Yeah, look, I think there's no issue in calling it a basic need at all. It is a human right, in my view. I'm going to try to wrap this up. Maybe just also say thank you to Vusi and Jason. I'm not sure if they're still on this. If they are, I would like to give them maybe a minute each just for their parting shots. Then, Vusimuzi, is that you? I think we're off. I don't hear Vusi. Maybe just to wrap up, Shane, Johan, and Sia. Maybe just give closing remarks that will help us maybe wrap this up and see how we can take this forward. Because I really think this discussion needs to carry on in different echelons of power, in different spaces, political, economic spaces, social spaces, for us to come right as a country. So maybe just to wrap off, Shane, then Johan, then Sia.
Okay. Thanks, Tulani. I think there lots needs to be done in this in the student education space, and I think if I have to look at a couple of key actions that need to be looked at both from the government and private sectors to basically look at the policy framework from a higher education space. And make the right choices. Government needs to make the right choices, incentivize the right programs, incentivize the right funding that they provide to universities, and make sure universities have the right program quality mix. Also, I think government needs to engage with private sector and work towards a PPP where NSFAS or the Department of Higher Education and Training can work with private sector to make this accessibility of funding more available to students, but also information flow like you talked about, and not it just being a privilege for the elite that we spoke about. And then obviously, universities exploiting their own income streams, whether it's through student fees, whether it's through subsidy, whether it's through income from research activities, advisory to private sector, et cetera, but to really grow their own cost efficiencies on their programs and make sure that they're not just churning out students for the sake of churning out students, but making them really employable for the future of the economy and for private sector. So I think that match between supply and demand is going to be critical. And then really implore students to protest and make this happen, but not at the cost of bringing down our institutions. And really working in tandem with partners like us, but also with government to make sure their voice is heard, but also to do it in a much more meaningful way. And just to cover Delia Jacobs' question, I think she was spot on in terms of talking about how the courses and the supply-demand gap that we have across universities is not linked to the NDP. So she's quite right. There is no linkage right now, and I think there needs to be a lot more, overlap and talking to in terms of the courses that we're adhering to and we're churning out graduates out of, and the National Development Plan 2030 goals. So that is definitely an area that needs attention as well. Okay. Thank you very much, Tulani.
Sorry, in one sentence, I don't think I can leave this question out from Apollonia. I think it talks to your relevance, and which I understand, but she's actually saying, why a third party to distribute the funds? And I know you can go on for days in this one, maybe just a quick one before we get to the other parties.
Why a third party like us, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we understand the bursary environment, and if you look at first party, so if you look at first party with the CETAs, NSFAS, if you look at the quality of deployment of funds and how efficiently and effective those funds were deployed, there are a lot of question marks around it. There are a lot of question marks around efficiency of how NSFAS disperses its funds. And of course, they're a big elephant, and a big elephant doesn't transform and turn around very quickly. But we've heard of a lot of issues in terms of disbursement of funds across the NSFAS. So what we bring on board is in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. And I think if you look at the return on investment in terms of throughput rates that we bring on board is itself one of the biggest reasons why ISFAP adds value, and all this value at 5% of the cost. So 95% of all the funding that we receive goes to the beneficiary, and only 5% is used to run the bursary, which is run ISFAP, because we also raise separately CapEx money in that space. So I mean, it's a value add. That's the bottom line answer.
I'm going to have to cut you off, Shane. We only have 2 minutes for Johan and Sia. Blame it on Shane for your parting shots. So Johan.
Tulani, thanks. There's really not much I can add. I think we've shed light on all the serious issues. I mean, it does seem as if everyone is playing there, but we just probably need to give time. Sia, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, so you on campus level do what you do, and it seems like Shane is having the necessary critical discussions on a high level, and it seems like the conversations are heading to that ideal sweet spot where we know it should be going. So it's just the time. We just need to give time, I guess.
Yeah. And from a high level, please include the seers of the world, because the boots on the ground need to be part of that conversation. Sia, as you close off.
Yes, no, I've largely been captured, but mine is just to say that it would be a disservice for us to just keep talking and not seeing any action and pressure for the implementation of whatever solutions we have brought. I think it would be a great disservice to us and to many students, and also it would be very, if it's possible, very nice to have governments also joining these panel discussions, because we're missing a vital part of the problem, and we can't just solve this problem amongst ourselves. We need governments to also come to the table, and that's largely what I have to say.
Thanks, Sia. I'm going to read a comment from Vusi. Efforts are being made. Much more can be done. The issue does not begin at tertiary level. So I think just to close off, thank you, Sia, Johan, Shane, for your participation. I really think that these discussions feed into understanding the different elements that contribute to student debt, that contribute to riots, and what actually is needed on the ground by students on a day-to-day basis. I would like to thank everyone at home for tuning in, and we hope to see you for our next critical discussion on this Cornerstone platform. I think the details were made available while we were going through this discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you, Thewan.